range of those who call themselves anarchists, which is pretty broad.
Yeah.
There would be at least a general agreement that whatever social structures and arrangements are developed, they ought to maximize the possibilities for people to pursue their own creative potential. And you can't make a formula for that.
No.
People are too different, and they ought to be different, and the differences ought to be encouraged.
Yeah.
And just like with raising children, you want them to find their own path.
Yes,
You don't
yes.
say, here's the rigid framework. I'm saying sometimes people do, but shouldn't say, here's the framework you're supposed to follow. And my own view, I differ from some of my close friends on this, is that we should be cautious about trying to sketch out the nature of a future society in too much detail. It's not that it can't be done. It can be done. It can be done in interesting ways, different ways, and has been done. But I think the real question is, to what extent is it important to do it, and to what extent is it important to just try and experiment and chip away at existing structures and so on. Actually, another problem, which I think must be faced, is that at any particular point in human history, people have not understood what is oppression.
Mm-hmm.
It's something you learn.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, if I go back to my, say, parents and say my grandmother, she didn't think she was oppressed by being in a super patriarchal family where the father would walk down the street and not recognize his daughter when she came, because you're not supposed to, not because you didn't know who she was, but because you don't nod to your daughter.
Sure.
That didn't feel like oppression. That just felt like the way life works. I mean, what psychic effects it had internally, that's a complicated question. But as anyone involved in any kind of activism knows, say the women's movement, I mean, one of the first tasks is to get people to understand that they're living under conditions of oppression and domination.
Mm.
It isn't obvious.
No.
And who knows what forms of oppression and domination we're just accepting
Yes.
without even noticing them. And at some further stage of self-enlightenment and communal understanding, we'll recognize those are things we have to deal with. And we can't plan for them if we don't know about them.
Linked to that, then, there's Emma Goldman, as she grew older and feared for the fact that there may not be an immediate revolution, became very influenced by, I think, Gustav Landauer, who talked about that the state isn't just out there, it's inside us, that we have to become ourselves as free as we can be in capitalism. That in fact that she was always worried that there may be a chance that people won't be ready for revolution, and that there is a way of developing the politics of the personal, so maybe more people could be ready to experience that life that's possible.
That's quite true. I mean, people, in fact, there are, the people who understand this the best are those who are carrying out the control and domination. I mean, in the more free societies like the United States and England, where popular struggles have won a lot of freedom over the years, and the state has limited capacity to coerce, it is very striking that it's precisely in those societies that elite groups, the business world, state managers and so on, recognized early on that they're going to have to develop massive methods of control of attitude and opinion, because you can't control people by force anymore. And therefore you have to modify their consciousness so they don't perceive that they are living under conditions of alienation, oppression, subordination, and so on. In fact, that's what, probably a couple of $1 trillion a year spent on this in the United States, very self-consciously. From the framing of television advertisements for 2-year-olds to what you taught in graduate school economics programs. It's designed to create a kind of a consciousness of subordination, and it's also intended specifically and pretty consciously to suppress normal human emotions. So normal human emotions are sympathy and solidarity. I mean, not just for people. I mean, for stranded dolphins. You know, it's just a normal reaction of people. And if you go back to, say, the classical political economists, people like Adam Smith, this was just taken for granted. It was the core of human nature. Any society's got to deal with this. Well, you know, one of the main concentrations of advertising and education is to drive that out of your mind. And it's very conscious. In fact, it's conscious in social policy right in front of our eyes today. So they take the effort to destroy Social Security. Well, what's the point of that? Well, the point is, there's a lot of scam about financial problems and this and that, which is all total nonsense. And of course they want, they'd like Wall Street to make a killing, but underlying it all, I think, is something much deeper. Social Security is based on a human emotion, a natural human emotion, which has to be driven out of people's minds, namely the emotion that you care about other people. You care. It's a social response, a community responsibility to care whether a disabled widow across town has enough food to eat, or whether a kid across the street can, go to school or something. And you have to get that out of people's heads. You have to make them say, look, you're a personal, rational wealth maximizer. If that disabled widow didn't prepare for her own future, it's her problem, not your problem. It's not your fault that she doesn't have enough to eat, so why should you care?
There is no such thing as society, as Margaret Thatcher said.
There's only you maximizing your own wealth and subordinating yourself to power and not thinking about anyone else. And that has an effect. You can see it in attitudes. Now, just get back to your point. The same is true of those who are trying to change society to more decent forms. Yes, you're going to have to deal with people's consciousness and awareness. And as I say, every organizer knows it. Take the women's movement as a striking example. It begins with consciousness-raising groups, where people talk to each other and bring out elements of their lives that they may not perceive very clearly. And it's true across the board, in educational institutions and factories, everywhere else. And it's very striking to see how this has worked over the years. If you go back to the early days of the Industrial Revolution, say like right around here, Lowell and Lawrence, the places where the textile mills were being created and so on, among the people who were drawn into the early factories, young women from the farms, Irish artisans from the slums and so on, there was an extremely radical consciousness. It was just natural. They didn't read Marx or anything like this, never heard of European radicalism, never heard of anarchism or anything else. It's just the natural assumption. It's in their, they had a very free press, something that's been lost. But the free press of those days expressed, just took for granted that wage labor is pretty much like slavery, and that those who work in the mills are on them, obviously. Why do we need these bosses telling us what to do? And that the whole factory system, industrial system, is just crushing our cultural values and creative impulses and turning us into robots and so on and so forth. All of this was understood, taken for granted. You go out to a working class neighborhood today, you won't find that. And that has to be, it's not that people have to be taught it, it has to be brought out from their inner nature, where it's been suppressed by very conscious efforts. Actually, it's very striking to see how conscious this is. So, about like a century ago, Taylorism was introduced into industry. Taylorism, Frederick Taylor was. So the idea was to turn workers into robots. So every motion is controlled, and they don't have any choices, and they become essentially robots. It was like everything else. It was initiated in the military system, because there you can carry out experiments cost-free and public and cost and risk-taking and so on. But then it was transferred to industry, mass production system and so on. And it did. Lenin was very enamored of it. It was terrific, because he basically had the same conceptions as capitalist managers. The idea was to robotize work. But it was very quickly recognized that, like the 1920s, that what they called on-job control, turning a person into a robot on the job, can be extended to off-job control. Mm-hmm. That is, controlling every other aspect of life the same way. So why should people not be robots in their entire life? And to be a robot means to focus your attention on what were called the superficial things of life, like fashionable consumption, not on care for one another, not on working together to create a decent environment, not for what will the world be like for your children. Just turn you into a passive consumer, an obedient a person who pushes buttons every couple of years and is taught that's democracy, follows orders, don't think, and identify your own value as a human being in the amount of useless consumption that you can carry out. And that's off-job control. And it runs through all the institutions. And it's a huge industry.
Yes.
And yes, to overcome off-job control and make people realize that your value as a human being isn't how deep you can go in debt and how many credit cards you can max out to get commodities you don't want. That's not your value as a human being. It's something else. I mean, when you go to a mall and over the weekend and you see young kids who are in their spare time, young girls usually, their spare time, what's fun, is window shopping.
Yeah. Yes.
I mean, that's, if they want to do it, you can't say don't do it. But what this tells you about how people's consciousness has been modified by off-job control is pretty frightening.
Yes, yes. I linked to that as well, one of the things that I think is striking when you look at the history of anarchism is that at its most popular, it was almost an organic movement and answering community needs. The Jewish anarchists in New York in the 1890s, in Spain obviously, but Argentina, as you mentioned, France. Isn't community also being destroyed by things such as technology, where now there are more communities in cyberspace than maybe the type of community that you or I may have grown up? Myself, I'm just a coal mining community where you knew everyone and everyone knew you, and yes, there were tensions, but you had that sense of relationships. Isn't that really going very quickly, and isn't technology helping that go?
Well, in my view, technology is a pretty neutral instrument.
Right.
It could go in that direction, it could go in opposite directions.
Right.
I mean, technology could, in fact, be used to let the workforce in a factory run it without any managers, by providing people at the workbench with real-time information that would enable them to join with others in making sensible decisions. That's another use of technology.
Sure,
of course, that technology doesn't get developed. And in fact, there are very interesting studies of how it does work. So one of the main studies was done by, some of the best was done by David Noble, who used to be here and a little too radical. Doesn't here anymore. But he did some terrific work on a lot of things. But one of the main topics he studied was what's called numerical processing. That is, computer-controlled machine tool production, that kind of thing. And that was, like everything else, developed in the military system, where you can do it at public cost. Right. But it was designed. There were a lot of different ways of designing it, he points out. So one way of designing it would have been to eliminate managerial levels and put decision-making into the hands of skilled mechanics. Who sort of knew what they're doing. They're usually the people who know more anyway than the guys in the offices upstairs.
Yeah.
And I'm sure it was true in the coal mine.
Yeah.
The guys in the coal mine work, the guys down there, not the one who's sitting in an office in New York somewhere. But so put the decision-making into their hands, and the technology could have been designed for that. And studies were done showing that would even increase profits. But it was done the opposite way. It was done in such a way as to increase levels of management control, which is highly inefficient, to de-skill mechanics, and to turn them into robots who would just push the buttons.
Yes.
Well, that's a choice as to how to use technology, and it's a kind of class warfare. But it has nothing to do with the inherent nature of technology. And I think the same is true here.
Right.
However, the point you make is an interesting one, and I don't know what's going to come of it. But it is true that there are virtual communities,
Yes.
which are very real. I mean,
Yeah.
I would say that 95% of my close friends I've never seen.
Yes.
We just interact all the time on the internet. And, my age, I figure it's perfectly reasonable. But when I see my grandchildren do it, I don't like it much. I mean, I think they have to learn
Yes.
things about face-to-face communication.
Well, just going, yes, because, I mean, my son does instant messaging, and he instant messages with people whom, when he's at school, he can hardly talk to.
Yeah.
But it provides a neutral framework. But I worry enormously because I'd rather he spoke and interacted.
I agree with you. I don't know what kind of effect this is going to have on young kids growing up.
Right.
I mean, they live in an imaginary world.
Yeah.
And even interacting with people who are adopting false personalities. When kids used to play Dungeons and Dragons, well, okay, I wasn't, I didn't love it, but I didn't see anything much wrong with it. On the other hand, when a lot of your life is in an imaginary world with characters who you have created themselves, and you don't have face-to-face human interactions with, that can have psychic effects which I don't think we understand, but could be pretty malevolent.
Taking that a step forward, you know that there is a tendency, certainly in the last 10 years in anarchism, we call it primitivism, anarcho-primitivism, who suggests that capitalism is so rotten, the technology involved in capitalism is so rotten, that we just ought to just get rid of the whole thing. It's so destructive, so corroding, so horrible that it's just damaging people. Let's just get rid of it and step, back or forward in their eyes to a more natural, organic world at one with nature. Is that possible?
I mean, I sympathize with the people who say that, but I don't think they are realizing that what they're calling for is mass genocide of billions of people, because the way society is now structured and organized, urban life and so on and so forth, if you eliminate these structures, everybody dies. For example, I can't grow my own food. It's a nice idea, but it's not going to work. Not in this world. And in fact, none of us want to live a hunter-gatherer life. There are just too many things in life that the modern world offers us. But just in plain terms of survival, that's calling for the worst mass genocide in human history.
Yes.
And unless one thinks through these things, it's not really serious.
Yes. I agree. Sorry, a couple of quick things now. A lot of people I know in Europe know you through your introduction to Daniel Guérin's book, Anarchism. And it's like while ago, AK Press put out his No Gods, No Masters in English.
It's right up there.
It's a great book. It's obvious that for Guérin, he was very keen to blend what I think he felt were the best aspects of anarchism and the best aspects of socialism into this libertarian communist, libertarian socialism.
Libertarian socialism is what he called it.
Do you think that those two terms, libertarian socialism and anarchism, are synonymous, or do you think there are real differences?
Well, I don't think you can really say, because the terms of political discourse aren't well defined.
Sure.
I mean, capitalism, trade, state, pick any one, they're pretty loose terms, which is okay. It doesn't make sense to try to define terms carefully when you don't have any explanatory theory to embed them in. But the fact is that we can't really answer the question. Anarchism covers too many things. Libertarian socialism covers too many things. But I sympathize with what he's trying to do. I think it's the right thing. I mean, I think if you look carefully, there are really close similarities and relationships among the anti-state, the more anti-statist, anti-vanguardist left elements of of the socialist movement, the Marxist movement, in fact. Say people like Anton Pannekow and others. There's close similarities between them and some of the wings of the anarchist movement, like the anarcho-syndicalists. In fact, it's pretty hard to make much of a distinction between, say, Pannekow's workers' councils and anarcho-syndicalist conceptions of how to organize society. There are some differences, but they're the kind of differences that ought to exist when people are working together in a comradely relationship.
Sure.
So yeah, that's a sensible blend.
Sure.
In my view.
And
I mean, the much sharper distinction is between all of these movements and the various forms of totalitarianism, like Bolshevism or corporate capitalism and so on.
Yes.
I mean, there you have a real break.
Yes.
I mean, totalitarian structures on the one hand, free societies on the other. In fact, I think there are similarities between significant ones between libertarian socialism and anarchism, this blend, and even very mainstream thinkers like John Dewey.
Yeah. Yes.
There's striking similarities.
Well, I know he was quite influenced by Stelton, the modern school, and he took a lot of those ideas and thought about and visited.
His basic view was that unless we eliminate what he called industrial feudalism and turn it into industrial democracy, which means pretty much workers' control, then the whole formal democratic system doesn't really mean very much. I mean, and he comes straight out of the mainstream American histories of Americans, apple pie.
A couple of quick things. I know from reading you, you're very much impressed, I think, it would be good, by people like Pannekow and go to that left communist strand. I take it you don't see a danger of things like workers' councils or the work of Pannekow or Gore to lead into another form of totalitarianism. You think that breaks from that?
No, I think there's plenty of danger.
Right.
But there's also danger that participatory economics could lead to totalitarianism.
Yes.
I mean, every one of us has been in movement meetings, and we all know the dynamics. If you're whatever you're working on, putting a traffic light on the corner or organizing resistance against the Vietnam War, whatever it may be, there's a meeting of people, and we differ in our levels of tolerance for boring activities. I mean, some people just drop off pretty fast, like me, for example. I just can't tolerate too much of it. Other people are really committed to basically controlling it. And there is a natural dynamic in which the most free, cooperative, libertarian structure can turn into an authoritarian one, just by virtue of who's going to stick around and, take enough control and finally make the decisions, and everybody wants to go do something else, and so on and so forth. Well, those are always dangerous.
The last person standing is the one.
And you'll never overcome it. We're all perfectly familiar with it from groups of friends, affinity groups working on something or other.
Yes.
So yes, those are always problems to deal with, and you can't. There's no magic formula for preventing that from happening. Okay,
and linked to that, I guess, is what you feel about the role of class in change in anarchism. It's no doubt that certainly I think in America there is a tendency in anarchism, in new anarchist thought, to see classes belonging to the past. It really isn't the most relevant loci of change anymore.
How many of those people have worked in your coal mining community, let's say, or on a factory floor, or as data processors in industry? I mean, if those are your jobs, you don't have any problem with class. Right. You know who gives the bosses and who gives the orders and who takes them, and you know why you understand the capital concentration that lies behind the choice of those who give the orders and those who take the orders. Now, those are class differences. Often some other domain you can say, I don't see them, but enter into the real life of people who live and work in society, and I don't think they have much problem discerning class differences and their significance. There's a huge difference between giving orders and taking.
Yeah. Yes.
And even if it's true that the people who are giving orders are taking them from somewhere else, but that's the nature of totalitarian systems. I mean, it's not the top guy gives the orders to the bottom guy. There's levels of transmission through which orders are taken and given, managerial supervision and decision-making of various kinds, and that creates a whole variety of fundamental class differences. And there are plenty of people who just take the orders, or else starve.
Yeah,
Choice.
Sure.
And in fact, we see class issues arising all the time. I mean, take, say, real concrete issues. Like one of the very concrete issues right now is what's called outsourcing.
Mm-hmm.
What attitude should people take toward outsourcing? And they're conflicting values. I mean, first of all, outsourcing is a very misleading term. Outsourcing is internal to totalitarian institutions. I mean, if GM outsources, that means they are transferring jobs to a company, a firm under their control, which is able to escape labor laws, environmental constraints, and so on, and to give them cheap inputs for the next stage of manufacturing. But that's all internal to command economies. So outsourcing is, it's kind of like a pretense. It has something to do with the free market, or doesn't. It doesn't. It has to do with internal workings of command economies. All right, what should our attitude be towards it? I mean, if people here are losing their jobs because you can get a worker at 10% of the cost in, say, India or China, should we be for it or against it? Well, there's arguments both ways. And I think all the arguments are highly misleading because they're accepting a framework that we shouldn't accept. I mean, if you accept the framework that says totalitarian command economies have the right to make these decisions, and the wage levels and working conditions are fixed facts, and then we have to make choices within those assumptions. Well, then you can make an argument that poor people here ought to lose their jobs to even poorer people somewhere else, because that increases, economic pie, and you go through the usual story. But why take those assumptions?
Yeah.
I mean, there's other ways of dealing with the problem. For example, rich people here, like people like me, for example, who are on the top few percent of the income ladder, we could cut back our luxurious lifestyles, pay proper taxes, all sorts of things, and I'm not even talking about Bill Gates. I mean, just people who are reasonably privileged. Instead of imposing the burden on the poor here, and say, well, you poor people have to give up your jobs because even poorer people need them over there, we could say, okay, we rich people will give up some small part of our ludicrous luxury and use it to raise living standards and working conditions elsewhere, and to let them have enough capital to develop their own, economy by their own means, and then the issue won't arise. But it's much more convenient to say poor people here ought to pay the burden under the framework of command economy totalitarianism. That's the easy way. But if you think it through, it's certainly not the only way.
No, it's not. No.
And almost every social issue you think about, real one, live one, the ones right on the table,
Sure.
Has these properties.
Right.
We don't have to accept and shouldn't accept the framework of domination of thought and attitude that allows only certain choices to be made. And those choices almost invariably come down to how to put the burden on the poor.
Yes.
That's class warfare.
Yes.
You don't want to call it class, don't use the word, but it's class warfare, even by real nice people like us who think that it's good to help poor workers in China.
Yeah.
But within a framework of class warfare which preserves our own privilege and transfers the cost to the poor here. And these are
Critical.
Again, matters of raising consciousness among very decent people, our friends.
Aye. Here's a more grim question, I guess. Voltaire de Cleyre, in the 1900s, in an essay, talks about the hope she has of a peaceful change into a better world. and talks about then that the masters who are creating such a system that they're going to reap a horrible whirlwind. Now, are we still in a situation where a peaceful transition to a freer, better world is possible for us? Or can we not say, or is it unlikely as the years go on?
Actually, nobody knows.
Right.
But my own subjective judgment, low credibility subjective judgment, is that the opportunities for peaceful change are considerably greater now than they have been in the past.
Right.
And the reason for that is that the repressive apparatus of state and corporate power has been reduced. You can't break up strikes with Pinkerton guards anymore. They won't get away with it. You can't send out the police to smash up working class self-run towns like Homestead, Pennsylvania, and the National Guard. You can't get away with that anymore.
No.
Well, all that makes a difference. I mean, enough victories have been won,
Yes.
so that repression has reduced. I mean, just take a look at this simple question of how many workers get killed in labor action.
Yeah.
Well, it used to be very high.
Oh, yes.
And it went up to the late 1930s.
Yes.
I can remember it as a kid, workers getting killed in labor actions by security guards, Pinkerton's police and the rest of it. That has stopped.
Yes.
Maybe occasionally it'll happen, but it's a substantial change.
Certainly, when we look at the Emma Goldman papers,
Yeah.
we look at the New York Times, or we get students to look at the daily papers of the 1890s. I think every week there's an
Hundreds
unnamed
of workers
worker
getting
just
killed.
being killed.
I mean, I saw it as a kid.
Yeah.
In my childhood memories of watching police wade into groups of women strikers outside a textile plant and just beating the shit out of them.
Right.
Well, I don't think you get away with it now.
No.
All right, and that generalizes. Just like it'd be much harder now for the U.S. to institute a military coup in, say, Brazil than it was 40 years ago. Much harder. In fact, probably impossible, because there have been just enough changes so that people won't accept it anymore, and the structures of power have dissolved.
Right.
By now, in fact, a lot of the structures of power are very fragile. A lot of them have shifted from direct coercion to indoctrination and thought and attitude control. Well, that's bad enough. It's bad enough to have your kids bombarded with horrendous television, but it's a lot different than having them beaten over the head by police.
Yes.
Okay?
Yes.
And having torture chambers around and so on. So those changes mean that there are many more options for peaceful change.
But it does make it more complex to fight back.
Yeah, it makes it very complex because you have to fight out of...
At least if there's a Pinkerton guard, you know who your
You
enemy
know who your
is.
enemy is. And when it's your friendly executive in the soulful corporation who's really on the same side that you are, and so on and so forth, then it's harder. But it doesn't mean it's impossible.
No.
Just a couple of days ago, I happened to be giving I hope I'm not giving personal things away, but I happen to give a talk, which I do every year, to a terrific group of mostly young labor activists in a group at Harvard, which is run by a fantastic person, Elaine Bernard, who's a real dynamic, live wire, labor activist, feminist, terrific. This program for the bringing the young labor leaders into Harvard was begun, I guess, around 1940 as part of the corporate academic reaction to this very perceived threat, real threat, of significant radical labor action that might just revolutionize the country. I mean, after all, a sit-down strike is like one thought away from taking over the plant. And it was really close, and it was understood. Well, part of the technique of undercutting that, as it was becoming harder to use Pinkerton guards and police and so on to smash this up, it became understood that what you have to do is socialize the rising young labor leadership, civilize them, teach them how to bring them to Harvard and do what Harvard's good at. In fact, what it does with its own students. teach them how to have polite conversations and class solidarity, and drink the right wine, and just pick up the right attitudes into relations and so on. So let's stick these young guys in the business school, and they'll see we're all friends and we're all doing the same thing, and so on and so forth. And it went on like that for years, until Elaine Bernard took it over about 10 years ago.
Subvert that.
Almost instantly, it's become a center for radical international labor activism.
Yeah.
And the reason is all these ideas are just barely below the surface. And just puncture the surface slightly, and it all comes out.
Yeah.
Because it's all so natural and obvious. It takes massive effort to beat it down. And by now it's completely different.
Yeah.
But and has big effects all throughout the world, because people come from everywhere. Well, that can be done in all kinds of places, but those are modes of peaceful change. And they've, just in our own lifetimes, they've led to very big changes. And in the past, even more. Something like, the changes go in both directions. So on the one hand, you can't crush Homestead the way you could 100 years ago. On the other hand, the consciousness that led to Homestead is gone. So it's not just progress, but rebuilding that consciousness is the kind of peaceful activity that can be carried out, and is in many respects a lot easier than fighting the National Guard.
Yes. A final question, because I think we're running out of time. I've just been working on Berkman's book Now and Then, and just AK Press have just republished it, What is Anarchism? Reading his letters in the 20s when he's working on the book, and he's finding it very difficult. One of the things that he's trying to come to grips with, I think, in the book is, well, why haven't people come to this idea? This idea, which to me is just common sense, is just what we were saying earlier, this natural instinct almost to solidarity and support. And I've seen Russia, I've seen totalitarianism in action. Why haven't anarchist ideas had a greater impact in the world? I think he's talking about. Now that's 80 years ago nearly. And the question we're also facing as people who at least believe, what is it, Emma Goldman says, anarchism is the only belief that shows men and women their true self, who they can be. We see that, we know that instinctively, yet it's still had such a minuscule impact. Is that true, or is it
First of all, I don't think it's true that it's had a minuscule impact.
Right.
A lot of the progressive social change of the past century, isn't anarchist. Like a progressive taxation isn't anarchist, Social Security isn't anarchist, but it's a reflection of attitudes and understanding, which, if they go a little bit further, do reflect anarchist commitment. And they are based on the idea that there really should be solidarity, sympathy, community, mutual support, mutual aid, and so on and so forth, and opportunities for creative action. And they're all based on these. They don't, they're subdued and channeled and modified, so they don't take real libertarian forms. But they're there, and they lead to social change. Why hasn't it gone further? Well, a large part of it is violence. So take, say, Berkman's experience in Russia. He entered into a violent totalitarian state. Up until the Bolshevik takeover, coup, revolution, whatever you want to call it, up until that, there were very significant popular libertarian, sometimes anarchist initiatives all over, running from peasant anarchism in the Ukraine to workers' councils, the Soviets, and so on and so forth. Well, they were simply smashed by force, by great violence. Lenin and Trotsky were totalitarian extremists, and they had a theory behind it. They were kind of dedicated Marxists who believed that a backward, primitive country like Russia can't go to socialism. The master's principles tell us that. And therefore we have to drive the country by force through the stages of essentially state capitalist development, and then ultimately something will happen. I mean, they weren't repeating the master accurately. This required suppression of many years of Marx's later work, which were literally suppressed when he was studying the peasant societies in Russia and so on and so forth. But that doesn't really matter. I mean, the point is they had a conception, they used it, they had the force. It wasn't easy, like, to destroy Makhno's movement or Kronstadt or to eliminate the Soviets and so on. It wasn't a trivial operation, but it was carried out. And Berkman saw it, and he saw a vicious totalitarian society arising very much the way anarchists had predicted.
Yes.
I mean, Bakunin spelled it all out.
Yes.
In fact, even Trotsky in his
Yes.
early work before he joined it said what was going to happen, as did Rosa Luxemburg and others. But it happened. And that's their variant. Our variant was different. Berkman was writing right after Wilson's Red Scare, which made the Patriot Act look like a Tea Party. It was a violent repression run by the progressives, Woodrow Wilson and others, and not just affecting, anarchists, not just Emma Goldman, who was kicked out, but even people pretty much in the mainstream, like Eugene Debs, leading labor figure. Wilson was completely vindictive. Tossed him to jail because he raised some questions about the nobility of Wilson's war and refused even to grant him an amnesty when everyone else was granted an amnesty. This was real vindictive. And it really crushed independent thought, crushed labor, had a big effect. So it was violence. Alongside the violence, there is the rise of massive propaganda. That's the rise of the public relations industry to try to control attitudes and beliefs. But quite apart from that, there's something quite simple. There are disciplinary effects to the way life is organized. Take, say, students today. Students today are more, in some ways, in a lot of ways they're freer than they were 60 years ago, their attitudes and commitments and so on. On the other hand, they're more disciplined.
Yes.
They're disciplined by debt.
Yes.
Part of the reason for arranging education so you come out with a heavy debt is so you're disciplined. Or let's take the last 20 years, the neoliberal years roughly, what's called globalization, but neoliberalism. A lot of it is, a very striking part of it is just aimed at discipline. It wants to eliminate freedom of choice and impose discipline. How do you do it?
Yeah.
Well, if you have a couple in the United States now working, each of them 50 hours a week to put food on the table, you don't have time to think about how to become a libertarian socialist. What you're worried about is how do I get food on the table tomorrow?
Where can I shop cheaply?
I got kids to take care of, and I got something to do with them. When they're sick, I've got to go to work, and what's going to happen to them? And that's well-designed techniques of imposing discipline. And there are costs to trying to be independent. Just take, say, trying to organize a labor union. If you're the organizer, there's going to be a cost to you. Maybe the workforce will gain, but there's a cost to you. We know there is. We know what the cost is, not just in energy and effort, but just in punishment.
Yes.
And the people who are living in fragile circumstances they make a reasonable calculation. They say, why should I take the cost? I've got to get by. So there are many reasons why normal instincts and attitudes don't come out. But, over time they often do. That's why we have social change for the better.
Okay. Hey, thank you for your time. It's really kind.
Okay.
It's really kind of you. Great to meet you as well. Thank you for your time.